Well, welcome to the TD Lecture 2022. I'm Susan Phillips, professor in the School of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University and graduate supervisor of the Master of Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership. Thank you for joining us in this session on the future of NextGen Philanthropy. To begin, we'd like to acknowledge that Carleton University is situated on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. And we recognize the many Indigenous nations in your locales. As settlers, as immigrants and their descendants, and as visitors, we honor and respect the many Indigenous peoples of our land and hope for a more equitable and just future together. One of the aims of the MPNL is to be part of thought leadership for the sector by hosting and engaging conversations about timely issues facing philanthropy and the nonprofit sector. As part of these public conversations, Carleton University is grateful to TD for their leadership as one of the first and key supporters of the Master of Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership, including sponsorship of this annual lecture. We are pleased to be joined by Unavakatara Maya, Senior Manager of Philanthropy, Sustainability, and Corporate Citizenship at TD. In addition to her current position, Uma's had extensive engagement with the sector, including as Director of Social Innovation with the United Way and as Inclusion and Philanthropy Fellow with AFP. Uma, thank you for joining us and for your support with TD for this event. Uma, we welcome you to say a few words and on behalf of TD, our sponsor.
Perfect. Thank you, Susan. Sorry, I was on mute. Hello, everyone. It is my absolute pleasure to be here on behalf of TD. Congratulations on the 10th year anniversary of the program. It's been incredible to set an amazing foundation with you over the last decade. And it is through your great work and teachings that current and future leaders are being equipped with the strategy and innovative thinking needed to approach philanthropy differently. It is really impressive, more than 200 graduates from the program that have gone on to work in charitable and nonprofit leadership positions, as well as corporate organizations, private and public foundations, and all levels of government. I am personally thrilled about today's discussion focused on the transformation taking place within the philanthropic sector. No doubt it shall be an engaging time together. I'd like to quickly touch upon what it's like leading a small yet mighty team that sets and implements the bank's philanthropic strategy across our Canadian footprint. Our philanthropy is tied to our corporate citizenship strategy, the TD Ready commitment, which is a multi-year initiative aspiring to help open doors to a more inclusive and sustainable tomorrow. And our strategy takes a holistic approach, factoring financial, environmental, social, and equitable health outcomes to help create the conditions needed for people to feel like they can succeed in a changing world. And we believe that working holistically is the way forward, both inside and outside of the bank, and will help support the transformation we're all experiencing in the sector. So, to all of you here today, the future leaders of philanthropy, thank you for your dedication, collaboration, and leadership. You're already helping to leverage philanthropy as a vehicle to help drive tangible, inclusive, and equitable change. Thank you, everybody, for your time today.
Thank you, Uma. And as we celebrate this 10th anniversary year of the Master Philanthropy Nonprofit Leadership, we are so pleased that TD was there with us from the start. The topic of today's event is a recognition that philanthropy today is not your grandparents' philanthropy. A younger generation is engaged in a variety of ways, and they're doing philanthropy differently. The research, which is overwhelmingly US, suggests that among affluent next-gen philanthropists, they're engaged with more than money, engaged with time and talent as well as treasure. That impact comes first, that they're very active in creating their own philanthropic identities. But we don't want to stereotype, and we have intentionally called this panel the futures, plural, the futures of next-gen philanthropy, as there's no one mode or approach. Rather, our aim is to explore a variety of these approaches and the landscape of next-gen philanthropy overall. We've asked each of our panelists to speak for a ridiculously short period of time, about 8 minutes each. We'll then have a discussion with them and open the conversation to the audience. So please, as you think of your question, put them in the chat, and our technical team will sort through them and read them out as we have time, and then the panel will do a final wrap-up. We've invited two people who bring very different personal experiences and approaches to their philanthropy, and one who has an overall landscape perspective as a philanthropic advisor. By way of introduction, I will not do them justice. Their accomplishments are much greater than we can capture in a short bio, but the longer versions are on the website. Our first speaker, and I'll introduce them all, is Sabina Vohra-Miller. She's the co-founder of the Vohra-Miller Foundation, which aims to make systemic, sustainable, and meaningful change to healthcare in Canada. Sabina has an MSc in clinical pharmacology and toxicology from the Dalai Lama School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, and is currently pursuing a Doctor of Public Health there. She's extensive experience building things in the sector, including as founder of the Unambiguous Science, a fact-based education program that aims to make science accessible and approachable, and is co-founder of the South Asian Health Network. A first-generation immigrant and woman of color, Sabina believes strongly in community-based approaches that help to build a more resilient and equitable Canada for all. Isaac Olowolafe Jr. is an award-winning real estate entrepreneur, an angel investor, and philanthropist. His corporation Dreammaker operates multiple divisions, including real estate development, which recently completed the first major mixed-use development, Dream Residences, in Toronto, and a boutique hotel, Dream Suites, near Pearson International Airport. He's also co-founder and general partner of BKR Capital, a venture capital firm that invests in Black-led companies. Isaac completed a bachelor in economics at the University of Toronto and has received numerous awards and recognitions. His philanthropy includes general donations, for instance, for a digital media experience lab at Toronto Metropolitan University, and the Black Innovations Program, also at TMU. Isaac is part of the Black Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, led out of the Sprott School of Business here at Carleton. Dr. Sharilyn Hale is president of Watermark Philanthropic Counsel, which helps those who give well, and to engage their families and channel their wealth and influence for good. She works with leading philanthropists, generous families, and social purpose organizations across Canada and the Caribbean. And I highly recommend to you her recent report on philanthropy in the Caribbean, which is on our panel perspectives. Sharilyn is a faculty member of the US-based Ultra High Net Worth Institute and a trainer with BoardSource. She holds a doctorate of education focusing on family philanthropic governance from St. Mary University of Minnesota, because there is no equivalent PhD in Canada. and holds the Master Financial Advisor Philanthropy designation. Her work includes serving as Vice Chair of the Toronto Public Library Foundation and as a member of the Advisory Council of our Master Philanthropy Nonprofit Leadership. Welcome to all of you. Sabina, would you like to start us off, please?
Be happy to. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. Really thrilled to be amongst some incredible panelists and looking forward to a great discussion. My husband and I created our foundation in 2020. In fact, we got the CRA notification the week Canada went into lockdown. So it was pretty interesting times when we first started. Our focus is on the health of the planet and its people while we take a very intentional approach to embed equity into all of our giving. Now, my own personal background is in healthcare and scientific research. So when we started, I had absolutely zero experience with anything philanthropy related. And frankly, the journey to where we are today was not a linear line. Frankly, linear lines are overrated. My point A to point B looks like a corn maze one finds at a pumpkin patch that I took my son to yesterday. But along the way, I've learned so much. And we began really, like most other people, giving to causes that were meaningful to us. And when we first started, we actually predominantly gave anonymous gifts because we didn't want really the attention that came with philanthropy. But as we got more invested in our giving, I realized that I did not see any representation within this world of philanthropy. Philanthropy in Canada, as I often say, is not brown, it's not a woman, and it's definitely not a first-generation immigrant. So as we began to invest in our community, I realized the power of not just using my platform to raise awareness and funds, but also the power that exists to mobilize others, and that putting a distinct name to a cause has a massive potential of elevating it. And of course, showing that philanthropy in Canada is diverse, it's not monolithic. That really, when I came to that realization, is when the Vohra-Miller Foundation truly to adopt even one of these, I would consider this to be a successful panel. I always say, if you go to something and you take one thing out of it, one key nugget, then that means that was time worth spent. So first of all, give generously. The 5% allocated by CRA is simply not enough. The need is there today. And if we're able to use philanthropy to make systemic changes to our community, then we might actually stand a chance to negate or at least reduce the need for future philanthropy. We all have that shared goal of leaving the world a better place for the next generation. And what better way to do this than to invest in that today, not tomorrow, but today. Second of all, focus on equity. Majority of donations go to big institutions and nonprofits, whereas those working on the front line of the community level are often overlooked. And that's usually typically because they're not sexy enough, they don't necessarily spend as much time on stewardship, but they are the ones working on overdrive on the front lines. Less than 2% of donations, in fact, go into grassroots efforts. Remember, real change always occurs at the community level because these are the people that know where the need is in their community and know how to ensure these needs are met in an equitable way. So empower them to make the change that we need. Some of the most impactful giving for us, in fact, has been on pilot projects that no one else wanted to be the first to fund because they had no idea whether it would be successful or not. But all of them, I am so happy to say this, but all of them have resulted in systemic changes, whether it be things that we've done with respect to mobile testing units for those who are underhoused or those who are distrustful of healthcare, to community health ambassadors that work tirelessly to get their communities safe from COVID, get them vaccinated, to patient navigators that help with the wraparound care, to things like refugee clinics that in fact are very rarely funded by the government. The best part is that we often only needed to fund these for around 2 years before funders saw the value in these programs and picked up the funding needs from us. So it's a short-term investment with long-term potential, and that is really key. Third, make it unrestricted. If you take the time to do a thorough due diligence on an organization and you want to support them, then know that they are the best suited to understand where funds are needed the most. I speak to so many organizations on a regular basis who have funds for new programming, but in fact need to shut down already established and very critical programming that they simply don't have funds to continue, or they don't have funds to pay for rent because everyone wants to only fund the new and shiny programs. So let them make the decision as to what is best for their own organization. And last, and this is really key, get involved. I do think this is where NextGen really thrives and flourishes. Research show this, but I'm also certain that all of you have seen this anecdotally from your own circles. The next generation are not typically the type to simply cut a check and move on. They tend to also give their time, they give their expertise. They cultivate a really, really close and meaningful relationship with the causes and the groups that they support. This is change-making philanthropy at its core. These aren't band-aid solutions, but in fact, solutions that end up changing policy, that transform thinking, that dismantle colonial structures. This is what we need. So support it, get involved, and be part of that. And so I'm going to stop here because I can go on and on, but that's it for me for now, at least. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabina. What a great start, and for important and key takeaways. Isaac, you've taken a somewhat different approach in that you've blended your entrepreneurship with your philanthropy, and you've also tended to give to institutions where Sabina has talked about the importance of the grassroots. So please fill us in on your journey to and through philanthropy.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here today. Thank you for the invite and being on this great panel. It's an exciting conversation, especially at the current times that we're in, when we see so much impact having on underrepresented communities and vulnerable individuals and communities as well. My journey in philanthropy really has been organic, was never really planned, was just based on environments that I've been placed in. A little bit of background on myself, originally born in Nigeria, came here when I was 4 years old. And, my parents right from early sort of instilled the aspect of giving back through our faith. So every Sunday I knew the aspect of, paying your tithes, but not only giving back from a monetary point of view, but giving back from a time point of view. So I saw that through my parents, whether it was with cousins and uncles who were new to the country, whether it was through babysitting or providing shelter, all those little things, whether from a resource point of view or just being able to share what they have or share experiences. So I saw philanthropy very early in multiple different ways in terms of how it could have an impact. And then when I got into University of Toronto, I started to realize the value of institutions and how institutions can help in magnifying a situation and help to creating solutions that last. But I also recognized very early that from my community, that institutional relationships was very critical for causes to be able to be impactful from a long period of time. So my journey started off as a real estate broker, then turned real estate developer, but along the way, always thinking about how could we make impact, not waiting until sort of my business and my career has gotten to the point where I could financially, but as I'm gaining different experiences, entering different doors, how could I open up those doors and utilize that to create an impact and sort of create donations and create philanthropic impact. So the first one after graduating was the Endowment for African Studies at U of T. Again, not even taking African studies, I knew that education was a key factor, not only for myself, but for my parents and for a lot of individuals coming from Africa, specifically Nigeria. But obviously, when you have to deal with tuition, it sort of limits the potential for that student. So we were fortunate to start with that about almost 16 years ago under African Studies. And that was the first institutional engagement that I had. And through that relationship, it opened up a lot of doors. So right away, my focus started to be around education, housing, and also small businesses. Because I was trying to incorporate three major things that I felt will create a sustainable economic thriving community for my community, the Black community within the greater Toronto, which was building institutional relationships, driving home ownership, and building more small businesses. So really, knowing that those were the three areas I was trying to incorporate, we were trying to see how could we do that while giving back. So after the endowment, the next area was in partnership with Ryerson University around tech and innovation. This was when we started to see the impact of technology across the board. And that was through creation of the Isaac Olowolafe Digital Media Lab, and really providing a space where the youth at Jane and Finch and Scarborough could get access to a room with an institution and see a name that will resonate with them. And that's where representation started to become very key with me. I know when it comes to philanthropy, is doing it behind the scenes and doing it in the forefront. For me, because at the age I was doing it and from the background I was coming in at it, I wanted to make sure that I was showing representation so that I encouraged those that were from my community that they could also start in one capacity or the other. And we're hearing so many stories now from young individuals, young entrepreneurs, those even in school that are finding ways to give back just based on the different practices. So when we started the room for digital media, it gave exposure to STEM, exposure to a lot of youth, and we also had a focus on girls as well to technology and innovation. So we were laying the foundation of what we felt was our next major gift around launching the Black Innovation Fellowship. The whole premise around launching the Black Innovation Fellowship, the first of a kind in any Canadian university, was to create more employment within the community, because we felt the more employment that's created and the more employers that's created, the more excess capital will be created within the community, which indirectly will create more donation into infrastructure and giving within the community, because more wealth is being created through businesses. And we're excited to see that impact already. So that was on the technology side. And of course, seeing the impact of health within the community. That's when we made a strategic alliance with Sick Hospital. Again, being from Nigeria, sickle cell is a situation that impacts the Black community more, specifically West Africa. And again, to magnify the conversation around it is why we decided to partner up with Sick Hospital and launch a fellowship for sickle cell. So again, this was another initiative where we're utilizing a major institution and bringing the institution into the community. So the reason why we don't try from grassroots to the institutions is because myself, I'm already in the grassroots. I'm already in the community doing the work. And sometimes it's good for institutions to be able to get an understanding of that. So what we've been doing over the last 10 years is opening the doors and getting into the institutions, sharing what some of the needs are at the grassroots side, and seeing how we bridge the two. So we feel with the Sickle Cell Fellowship, not only are we doing that here, but the doctor that started the fellowship is from Nigeria, staying here in Canada and working at SickKids for 2 years. And then we'll go back to Nigeria after learning best practices. And as mentioned earlier, the one that we're very excited about is now the Knowledge Hub research in collaboration with Carleton and multiple universities across Canada. Once again, this is another form of donation and philanthropy that incorporates research, that incorporates data. And we believe that through this information that's going to come out over the next couple of years will make substantial generational impact within a community that lacks the data. And through that, indirectly start creating more donors and more philanthropists in the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. Again, quite different approaches, and we'll pull some of the threads together in our conversation. Sharilyn, you've studied philanthropy both from an academic perspective and an experiential perspective in your role as an advisor. So you may have an opportunity to see many different approaches across a wide range of philanthropists. So tell us more about that landscape.
Sure. Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Uma and TD, and thanks for including me. So as a philanthropic advisor, I would say there are two ways that I bump into, engage with NextGen philanthropists. And the first one is as philanthropists in their own right as clients. So typically they are wealth creators, they're entrepreneurs, they are ambitious, they are impatient, and they want to be generous, and they want to engage, they want to dig in, and they want to do something meaningful with their wealth. And it's exciting, and they're bringing lots of ideas and value to the table, quite apart from just their wealth. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. The second component would be my work with NextGen philanthropists in the context of a family and a family system. And often they are inheritors, or they will be inheritors. Sometimes they're inheritors and wealth creators in their own right. But within a multi-generational family ecosystem, their giving can look a bit different. So those are the two lenses that I bring to the conversation today, in addition to the research hat that I wear, where generational considerations are certainly part of that exploration, because I think it tells us some important things. So I've been asked to give a bit of a landscape view of what's happening in the space, and I think it's useful to start at a very basic level. Like, what do we mean by NextGen? How are we using that term, and why does it matter? Why do we think in terms of these generational categories? And at a very basic level, it's based on a belief that each of us is born into a unique moment in history, right? That is informed by social, cultural, economic, political realities, and it's a context that shapes us in our growth, in our maturation and development, and brings shape to our thinking, our values, our behavior, and so forth. And so by defining some categories to group people together, reflecting these influences, we can better understand ourselves. Perhaps we can better understand those who are from different generational categories, but we can also perhaps better understand behavior and even predict behavior. I always offer the caveat that we can't be too dogmatic, right? That each of us are informed by so many factors, in addition to some of those external factors. But in the case of philanthropy, I do think it's relevant and worthy for this discussion and this type of exploration, because it does tell us some very important things. So very, very broadly, and if you do a quick Google of generational categories, you'll get the common framework that is used more often now, beginning with the civics, who were born before 1945, the infamous baby boomers born before 1964, my generation, the Gen X, born before 1980, and then the millennials born after 1981, followed by Gen Z and Gen Y. From a research and data perspective, the most prominent differences between the generations really show up between the millennials and the boomers. And the small cohort of us in the middle, the Gen X, we kind of straddle in terms of our giving behavior, and that can be informed for a lot of reasons. But these categories, and certainly with the work that I do with families, I see the biggest differences or disparities, divergence also between those categories. I think the other way in which we use the term next gen, I think increasingly when people say next gen, they mean millennials and younger. But next gen is also used in a broader context that is less about age and more about position within a family. So certainly for families with wealth, it could be business owning families or investment owning families. The talk is about generation now, those who traditionally hold the wealth, hold the power and influence within the family system, and generation next. So some of my work with next gen philanthropists, they're actually in their 50s and 60s. And there are responsibilities and some expectations in that context. So I think that distinction is an important one and useful as we continue to talk. And sometimes those positional categories can line up with the age categories, but not always. Okay. So what do we know? Susan has has referenced some of them, and you've heard it already in the wonderful examples that Sabina and Isaac have identified, and you've also heard where there's some variation. So very high level. First, between the generations, it's not always a difference so much in what they support, but how they go about giving that support, right? And so much more focused on movements and issues that are driving their motivation for giving. So it's less about institution building, but institutions can be powerful in movements and tackling issues, right? And so I think that's an area where there can be some overlap, and we can explore that more closely. I think the other part of that is really embracing multiple platforms to do good, right? So there are the donations that are eligible for a charitable tax receipt, but next gen donors are also, they're into crowdfunding, they're into social activism, ethical consumerism, social enterprise, the blending of entrepreneurship and philanthropy. And using their influence, their social influence, right? And so we often talk about the 4 T's: your time, your talent, your treasure, and your ties. How can we mobilize these to create change? And I think also an alignment and a desire to be authentic, right? So if I make my money this way, over here, it needs to align with how I'm giving it, or vice versa, right? As opposed to those silos that this is one component of my life and this is the other. So much more integration and a desire to, at the very least, feel authentic, if not be viewed as behaving in an authentic way across the various spheres of their life. The second area is around technology. You've heard the term digital natives, but that has 2 prongs. One being how they define community, right? My community for next gens is typically on a macro level, it's global, right? But on a micro level, it's hyper local, right? So you see both of those show up in next gen giving. It's also about how they are engaged and how they do engage. The Canada Helps Giving study that was released this year had some really good insights on that based on Canada and Canadian data. We don't have a lot of it, but the role of technology is critical. And then thirdly, next gen donors are more trusting, more trustful of charities. They are more articulate about the objectives of their giving. My conversations with my next gen clients, they get very clear about what they want either their giving as a whole or a specific gift to accomplish. And so they're able to have different kinds of conversations with their charitable partners. And this desire to dig in and to really understand, to learn, to become informed partners and informed givers is another part of that trend. So those are kind of three directions that are informed by research, and overall, I'm actually very optimistic. The other thing that the Canada Help study told us is that young people, they can't wait to have money so that they can give, right? And certainly for younger people who will be inheritors, I think the pre-work that we can do to expose and engage and kind of help them develop those building blocks so that when they are at the point for giving in a really financially significant way, that they're ready and that we're ready.
Thanks, Sharilyn. Let me start with a follow-up question and then on to Sabina and Isaac. One of the things we need to sort out if we're assuming that next gen implies younger as opposed to the next in a family context is the difference between a generational effect, that is the influence of when you were born and the context that you talked about, Sharilyn, versus a life stage effect. And that should we assume that, can we be confident that the expression of next gen philanthropy, as you described it, is actually generational, as opposed to simply the fact that people are young? They see things differently because they're young, and that might change as they then get older. The age of the boomers, they might do philanthropy very differently. You sounded like you made a case. It is a generational, not just a life stage effect. Sharilyn, do you want to pick up on that?
I'm sorry. I thought you had directed that to Isaac. So I was waiting patiently for Isaac to speak his truth. You know, I think it could be both, and I don't know that we have enough research to be definitive on that. You know, I've worked with families where the generational differences were actually very modest, right? Like there was a lot of alignment. So I don't want to overstate some of these things. And the other thing that I think relates to your question is sometimes, you know, we think about certainly the context of family philanthropy, the values going down in one direction, right? Like it's the parents distilling values, relaying values, teaching and learning. And yes, that is absolutely true. I've seen it. It's a very important, I think it's one of the beautiful things of family philanthropy. We did a session at the PFC conference, and someone raised their hand and made a very important point that none of the panelists had identified, was that it also goes up. Right. And I've seen that with my clients where, you know, it's the younger members of the family that are really driving new conversations up, up within the family that are changing the dynamics, getting their parents and their grandparents thinking differently about the role of philanthropy and how they're showing up. So I think all of those things are at play. And you know, among the younger wealth creators who are engaging in philanthropy, some of them are engaging their parents and grandparents in their philanthropy. So even, you know, when we talk about family philanthropy, it's not always that patriarchal model going down. So all of that, I think, speaks to, you know, how nuanced this conversation it is. And we just have to be attentive, keep the conversation going, but keep attentive.
That flows directly into Sabina and Isaac. Sabina, when you look at your peers in the sort of age group, are they doing philanthropy in a similar way to what you're doing, or do you see significant differences? And why be so engaged? It as opposed to just identifying the right organization and giving away, you know, and giving the money and then standing back.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, you know, I think going back to your previous question as well, it's so nuanced, and I think there's a lot of things that are actually working in the mix together, which I think is the beauty. That's actually where the magic happens, right? So I think with my peers, very often when they are actually able to give financially, they end up supporting causes that they've already been involved with for a very long time and now are just able to financially put money towards it. And so when that happens, I think that it's so in step with their passions, it's so in step with their social values as well, that it ends up being a really good marriage of where they're actually able to contribute their time, their expertise, their efforts, as well as contribute their finances. And for me personally, that is where I find the most satisfaction with the giving that we take, as well with our foundation. When I'm aligned with with what the work that the organization is doing, supporting them financially, but also being involved with their day-to-day activities, I feel I can champion them better. I feel I can advocate for the causes, which are very often very much aligned with my own values and what I am trying to do, what I'm trying to do in terms of making the world a better place. And so I find there's so much efficiencies that we can take, we can leverage and take advantage of when we are actually combining not just, finances, like not just cutting a check and saying, okay, well, nice to see you next year, but actually being involved in the cause throughout. And I think for me, that really is where I found a lot of our projects and initiatives have meant so much to us, and where we're seeing the most success with our giving as well.
And Isaac, you started as a significant philanthropist in your 20s. Do you see other young, successful entrepreneurs doing the same? And how does their philanthropy play out if they're engaged?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Over the last, I'd say 5 to 7 years, I've seen a large percentage, especially within my close network, and those that I don't know directly, I may bump into them at an event. They'll say because they saw an initiative that I did, let's say with Canada Basketball, when we did the jersey sponsorship of Canada Basketball, and then we utilized that platform to do financial literacy for youth that like sports. But we also use that as an opportunity to introduce them to technology and to STEM. So we use a sponsorship in basketball to get access to the youth that love the sport, but use that as an opportunity to introduce them to skilled trades, introduce them to STEM. Because if we just came in through the angle of just skilled trades and STEM, which is very important and needed for them, it would have been harder to penetrate than coming through something that they already love to do. And that's where the engagement piece comes into play. And that's why for myself, for my family, my wife, any of the initiatives and programs that we start, we love to get involved and love to have that engagement, because what it does, it stems through representation to the group or individuals or families that program or that donation is trying to hit. The best example with the Black Innovation Fellowship, we were very careful in how we were building out the team, making sure that there's diversity across the board with the program directors. There's gender diversity, bold, visible diversity as well too, so that when they're going out to the community to encourage entrepreneurs to come into the program, there's a nice seamless transition. When we're doing when we did the program with the financial literacy, again at different communities in Scarborough and in Jane and Finch, we were going to youth and sort of talking to them, bringing them down to the unions and saying that, okay, this is how you could start going from the streets to getting a job, going from incarceration to getting into the workforce, and using a program around it. And that really comes through engagement. I think if it's just simply just cutting a check and not being involved as an organization. So it's gone from me being involved as an individual to now our foundation, Dream Legacy, being involved in the engagement. And now we're bringing on individuals that have that same mindset, so that our organization is involved with programs and initiatives that we start.
As an educator, I'm always interested in how you learn to do this. And you, Sabina and Isaac, you both talked about your inspiration in the sense of coming from family and community and faith, and just an interest in expertise in the causes as well. But it's not just what you're giving to, but how you do it. So how did you learn to do this well? How have you learned as you go along? And then Sharilyn, you probably have reflections on how you see this across the many families you work with. Was it just trial and error, or did you figured it out as you went along, or are there ways to really help, in a sense, other young philanthropists who want to do good better in an engaged way?
I'll jump in. I think for me really is because I was doing a lot of programs and initiatives that I had an interest in. It didn't seem like much work, like I was learning something new, but what I was doing was bringing experiences that I was in, environments that I was in, and then seeing that there wasn't a lot of individuals that looked like me in those environments. And I felt the more doors that could be open to increase, whether from a gender point of view or from a visible minority point of view, in those spaces, that will have a ripple effect, an economic effect, which indirectly could create sustainability and donation back into other types of programs. So that's sort of, again, take it a little bit trial and error and seeing, okay, if this initiative work, how many groups can we engage compared to this initiative? Is it just starting a program, or is it starting a program and doing a wraparound with sports? Is it just going in this community or that community? Is it starting at this age? So we playing around with different types of programs to see what works. And I think now with the research piece that we're starting to do, we're going to start having data to be able to wrap around some of the initiatives that we want to be doing in the future.
Sabina, what's been your learning journey?
So, I mean, I think first of all, the one important thing that I would really encourage anyone who's starting out to do is take the time to figure out what the mission and the goals are for your foundation or for your philanthropic giving. I think we took a really long time to really nail down what our mission is going to be. And I think this is really important because there are so many extremely worthy causes out there, and it's going to be really hard for you to focus, right? And so if you are trying to make a meaningful and impactful change, having that laser focus on what you're trying to do is going to be extremely helpful. So now when I get grant requests, I can very easily tell whether this aligns with our mission or not. And this is great. To me, this is a win-win situation because we end up then spending time on causes that are very much aligned with our foundation. And in turn, the organizations that we are involved with have that benefit of us being fully committed to their cause as well. So I really do think this ends up being a win-win situation. So take the time to figure out what exactly your vision is, what your mission is, what you're trying to achieve. And the second thing for me, I've learned this through mistakes that I've made. Everyone's going to make these mistakes. And for me, I think one of the guiding principles for me has always been, if you don't look back at something you did many years ago and you don't cringe or you don't have this feeling of like, I should have done that better, I could have done that better, then it means you haven't grown in that period. So if you are actually taking a step back and looking at something in the past that you want to do differently, that means you're growing with your foundation, you're growing, with your mindset as well. So it's a good thing, it's a positive thing. And so I've definitely learned a lot from our journey. And I think, for us, one of the key learnings also is when to give a multi-year grant and why to give a multi-year grant. For instance, again, benefits on this being that the organization knows that they're getting specific funds every year, so they can actually have that strategic plan in place. And then on the flip side, we know if you are giving a larger amount, having it be a multi-year or a phased approach actually lets you evaluate as time is going whether what the organization is doing is matching what you are trying to actually achieve, and then reevaluate. So it could be after the term is up, you take a step back and you say, well, in fact, this did not align as well as I'd hoped for it to align, or in fact, this aligned exceptionally well. So let's accelerate our giving to the organization. And I think some of this actually comes as you get involved with the organizations, you start learning this. And then I think for me as well, being very involved with community actually helped hone us to understand how to do this and to find that right balance as well. And I will say, you know, I'm not anti-institution whatsoever. We have our fair grants. In fact, some of our largest grants have been to bigger institutions, again, for the same reasons that Isaac so beautifully outlined, you know, that is really where some of those big changes can occur. And especially when, you know, when we try and do any sort of initiative, we have that equity from the ground up. It's not a tick box that is going to be for us. For us, it needs to be embedded, you know. And so when you're actually taking that and you're partnering with a big institution, you know that it's going to be one of those instances where equity is given a front thought from the very beginning. So there's huge advantages to that. But I also think that sometimes when you want to be nimble, when you want to do things quickly, it can actually be a little more effective on the community level. And again, that's a balance, right? The balance between having some of the community efforts happening at the same time as some of the institutional impacts happening. And that is really where it all comes to play for me, at least.
And as someone sitting in a big institution, I want to be clear that we're not trying to sway the conversation in our favor. Sharilyn, you provide advice. You teach how to do philanthropy more effectively. What are your perspectives here?
So I think it speaks to a larger issue that we have in Canada about where do generous people get advice about giving. And, you know, we don't really have a home for that in Canada. And maybe that's something we need to build. So there are philanthropic advisors like myself, and we're able to work with individuals and families. Community foundations. I know there's some people from Toronto Foundation online today. They've had some beautiful outcomes from their NextGen engagement program to educate and bring along NextGen donors, and other community foundations also have initiatives. There are some charities doing some interesting programs to engage younger donors, both as, you know, in their own right and in the context of family philanthropy. And I do think for those who work in charities, I think that's the kind of the next knowledge domain to really develop on the fundraising side, is that fluency working with families as opposed to just individual donors. And then there's our private sector partners, right? There's an industry of family offices, wealth management companies that have donor advised fund programs, and they also have an important role to play. So I think, you know, it's dispersed in terms of where people are getting that information. But I was poking around in the chat. I know there's some curiosity about the wealth transfer that is happening in Canada, and I do think it's something that as the charitable sector that we do need to think about. How are we preparing for this, preparing people so that when and the wealth transfer is happening now. It's not something that theoretically is happening in the future. It's happening now. And from my observation with the clients that I'm working with, I think we're going to see more and more really wonderful examples of philanthropy and next-gen philanthropy as that comes on stream.
Thank you. We'll come to the questions in a moment, but are there questions you'd like to ask of each other, or things you'd like to explore more deeply that you didn't get a chance to do so? Or reflections or things you want to riff off on the other? Otherwise, I have more questions.
Yeah, I have a comment question. It's actually for Isaac. You know, I remember when you made that gift in the School of African Studies, and I didn't know you then. I think I probably had met you at an event or whatever. But I remember at the time and since, just the ripple effect that had, you know, that it was that kind of gift given by that kind of donor, right? A Black donor, a young donor. You know, we haven't talked about the diversity piece, but certainly the NextGen donors, they're more diverse than ever before, and they're bringing their own cultures of giving, you know, if their heritage is from other parts of the world. So I just want to acknowledge that to you, Isaac, that you know, even back then when I didn't know you and I was working in the charitable space, that had an impact on me hearing about your generosity and then following you since. And I wonder if you could comment on, you know, were you aware at the time as you were making the gift, what I mean, obviously you were aware of what you were doing, you gave the money, but the significance of that, was that part of your thinking and part of your strategy, or, you know, did it become so much more than what you had hoped for?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think at that time, and I really want to, you know, thank even U of T and, you know, Christian Mehta, who at that time created the opportunity and created a situation where a gift could have an impact not only on who I was trying to have an impact for, which is for students from African descent, taking African studies from the Black community, but also an impact on the general community as a whole on the aspect of giving back, but on the aspect of building institutional relationships, right? And when you now look at sort of where things are right now, with just recently the federal government announcing $200 million endowment within the Black community, it's really great to see. Or if you look at Honorable Jean Augustine's chair at York University, it's great to see now all the different initiatives that the Black community is doing with institutions. And that's how it stands with some of our engagement with institutions. It was almost 18 months ago when we started the Sickle Cell Fellowship at Sick Kids. And just recently BOF and Walmart sort of amplified that with their initiative around sickle cell as well too as Sick Kids. So it's great to see that that engagement has changed. And again, institutions come with infrastructure that's been built over years and decades. And so for me, what the purpose of the gifts that we do and the initiatives that we give, instead of recreating the wheel, let's find strategic partners, partners that understand the needs genuinely and really want to help and leverage the infrastructure that they're in. And you know, when it came to tech and innovation, we saw the impact of tech and innovation across multiple industries, across multiple communities. And we saw that even more during COVID. And I saw that there was a lack of exposure within the Black community. That's now changed because of those initiatives that started seven years ago. And now the big conversation is around affordable housing, which has always impacted a lot of different groups, regardless of the background. But now it's impacting mainstream. So now it's becoming a mainstream conversation. But as it becomes a mainstream conversation, if there's not representation from different groups at the table having those conversations, then those groups be left out when solutions come. So that's what's always been important with the work we do.
That's a natural follow-up question for Sabina. You work in health, which is a space that has many big institutions, big charitable organizations, all kinds of healthcare institutions, as well as universities. How do you identify sort of your distinctive niche and the organizations you want to work with in a way that really facilitates systemic change as opposed to protecting existing healthcare systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. And first of all, I want to say I am not I am not afraid to say no to when a cause is not aligned. And in fact, I just did this past week. It was a fantastic institution. In fact, I've been involved with this institution with my expertise for a very long time. But the actual cause that they came to me with was not equity focused and making healthcare equitable for all Canadians. And so for me, that was a very quick, but no, I love the work you do, but this is not for us. And I think that over time, I think with a lot of institutions in Toronto, it's becoming very clear to them to only approach us if it is something that is really aligned with equity. And so I think that some of the investments we've made, with the start of the Institute for Pandemics, for instance, with the start of a new pan-Canadian maternal health initiative called First Exposure that we're launching this year, with the Equity and Anti-Racist Center at St. Michael's Hospital. I think with a lot of these initiatives that we've been part of or spearheaded, in fact, with the first two, I think what's really important is that institutions are also aware that we want to make sure that anything that they're doing will be grounded in equity. And so when we're having these conversations with them, the first thing I ask is, how are you making sure that this is going to occur? And it really does make everyone think, right? It makes them think from the very beginning, how do we ensure that this is going to be not healthcare that is already being given to people who already have very good access to healthcare, versus actually to those who don't necessarily have that same access, whether it be people who are recent immigrants who don't have a health card, whether it be refugees who don't have access to health, whether it be people from racialized communities and marginalized communities that simply do not have access to healthcare. How do we make sure that when we're putting together this program, we are in fact at first taking into consideration communities that are under-resourced and how are we elevating them, and then talk about how this is going to be a more wholesome, project for the remainder of the community. That needs to happen because I think people don't understand the difference between equality and equity, and that is a huge I feel barrier in terms of some of the work we do. I think very often people think healthcare has to be equal. Everyone gets equal access. In fact, that's not true. Because there are communities who have had less resources, have structural barriers to accessing this from the very get-go, and to actually ensure we're all in the same level playing field, we have to first raise these communities up. And so, I think for us, it's been a journey to get to the point where I can be very clear with what our mission is. And I think that it's also helping us narrow down the projects and initiatives that we end up supporting.
Great. Thank you. Good lessons. Derek, you've been monitoring the questions. We do have some questions. Do you want to pose a first of those?
And I think our first one follows nicely on the conversation we've just been having, wondering about our next generation of givers and how the philanthropic sector itself can move to more equitable systems or utilize community philanthropy principles to help in that engagement.
Who would like to take that on as a start? It's a complex question in many ways, but an important one.
Derek, can I ask you to repeat the question? I want to make sure that I'm understanding it.
Yes, so looking at that next generation of givers, how we can use within the philanthropic sector itself, so all players within that sector, moving to the more equitable system using possibly community philanthropy principles or other principles. How do we help in that engagement and education, I guess, those next generation of givers?
So I assume it's not just working with community organizations, but the way in which you work with community organizations of shifting power, of empowering, of breaking down old systems. Sabina, you wanted to go first.
Well, I can just maybe start with one point and let others jump in. But I think the first very important part is education. If you actually don't understand what the issues are, there's nowhere you're going to address them, right? And so, first of all, if you are, if you're Canadian, look up some of our histories, look at some of the backgrounds that we've, in terms of, say, systemic discrimination, medical experimentation, things that have actually happened to the Indigenous communities in Canada, things that are happening to Black communities, South Asian communities. Look at COVID, right? We keep saying COVID disproportionately impacted South Asian, Black, and other racialized communities. But in fact, this is not a new revelation. This has been something that has been occurring for decades. It wasn't as though March 2020 happened and all of a sudden we realized that certain communities that are disproportionately impacted. This is a pattern that we are in fact continuously propagating. So educate yourself on a lot of this, and the onus has to be on each individual to educate yourself, and do not ask the labor from communities who are already being, oppressed and who already are marginalized to do this, education, the labor of education for you. Do it yourself. And I think that really needs to be the basis. And coming back, to one of the 4 guiding principles that I spoke about, always have equity at the forefront of everything you do. And a lot of this can come from community organizations by empowering them to do the work they're already doing. And they're doing a fantastic job already. So how can you as a funder amplify them? How can you as a funder empower them? That should be, the first thing someone looks at when it comes down to actually tackling some of these systemic issues. Well, those are 2 points. I meant to say 1, but they're 2. 2 for 1.
I think you've made a good case, Sabina, also for how how we look at some of these lenses through which to view the world, right? So not too long ago, we would have been thinking in terms of, okay, I'm going to support a social justice organization, right? As opposed to what I think is more impactful, that social justice, equity, that these are threads that can run through any kind of organization, right? So it's not about, and your example of a hospital, right, supporting a hospital that is doing work that is advancing health equity, that's a wonderful example. So I think that's just a useful way to frame it. Same with climate change. So the threads of climate change, both equity and climate change, very much on the radar, as you would imagine, for NextGen donors. So if you're not an environmental organization, that doesn't mean that NextGen philanthropists are not going to be interested in you, but using these lens to genuinely inform your work in the community, and then being able to communicate that will really help the message land, I think.
Derek, you have other questions in the chat.
We do. As a follow-up, one of our audiences asked about the unfunded report of 2020 and whether that has influenced the giving of NextGen foundations towards Black-led or Black-serving organizations.
A report which we were pleased to collaborate in with the Foundation for Black Communities.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely aware of the report and the great work that Lee Ban and his organization. I think he was part of it, and Carleton did in putting together that report, and it really shed a lot of light on the gaps when it comes to philanthropy, when it comes to donation, when it comes to allocation from endowment funds and pension funds to the Black community. And I think the governments are looking at that report as well too, and making their allocations as well. I think that's helped in moving the needle. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, but I think that report helped to shed light on some of where the gaps are, and how much more work needs to be done.
As having been part of that, it really illuminates what Sabina was saying too, is that we knew, we should have known, or we knew, but we didn't address it directly, of the multiple inequities. And it was very much having some data where you could pinpoint data and particular data points, like 0.013% goes, philanthropy goes to Black-led organizations. But it was amazing how some very straightforward data that we just hadn't had data out there before surfaced and pulled back the curtain on what we should have, since we knew, but we kind of ignored. And the simple data did change conversations in very, very important ways. Derek, you have other questions?
Can I just quickly jump in over here as well? But yes, absolutely. I think that report was extremely powerful, and it was similar to the one that was done by the Wellesley Institute in the middle of the pandemic, where they actually showed how disproportionately impacted racialized communities were with respect to COVID, right? And so it's exactly the same ideas over here as well. And again, I think that comes back to some of the points that I made earlier with respect to having a very clear mission and vision. And so for us, it is racial and health inequities. And so when you take that lens into everything that you give, you end up giving to organizations that are doing this work on the ground level. And they very often are, in fact, organizations that are run and led by people within your own community. So for me, I'm very much involved in South Asian communities for similar reasons, because they're also severely underfunded. And again, we're one of the more disproportionately impacted during COVID for similar reasons: frontline workers, precarious work, structural inequities, barriers, exactly the same reasons as well. And then, of course, I want to make sure that we're also talking about similar inequities in organizations that are led and run by Indigenous communities as well, right? And we again see that huge disparity. And I think the second thing, when I talked about equity in my opening remarks, it was about how big institutions and tend to end up getting a lot more of the funding than some of these smaller organizations that are led by community efforts as well. So again, finding that balance of actually having those big projects, but also supporting organizations that are from your community, from Black communities, from racialized communities, from Indigenous communities, are going to be really, really important as well.
As a researcher, I just want to put my hand up to say how important research is in our sector, whether it's academic research that's happening in formal institutions, community-based research, the reports that charities produce on what they're seeing on the ground. As an advisor to philanthropists, I will say it is incredibly helpful, not just for me in my roles as an advisor, but for my clients and others who access this report. They read it. It deepens their understanding, and they want to integrate the essence of the findings of this research in how they give. So just a shout out to those who spearhead research initiatives. They are incredibly important, especially in Canada, because we don't have enough research and data, but it matters. And I can give very specific specific examples with my own clients, where both that report, the vital signs report from the Community Foundation movement, all of these things help us understand the community better. And what I've observed among my clients and the years that I spent actively working in the charitable sector, when people are exposed and engaged, the level of care and empathy increases, their understanding increases, and then they want to do more. They want to step up, and they want to be better, give better, and so forth. And so I also think Carleton has an important role to play in that. So thank you to Carleton.
And we do know that I call them regular philanthropists, those who haven't done the kind of deep work that and knowledge gathering that Sabina and Isaac have. They know a few brands. They know very little about charities. There are a few big name brands, but they don't have the knowledge of the sector. So starting there is important. Derek, do you have other questions?
We do. So to all the panelists, how can we encourage a balanced dialogue between the different generations of philanthropists?
I think engagement is key. I know for myself, when I first started, I was 24, 25, and I remember, Christian, knowing that I was, wearing a few hats and busy. We were doing a lot of tech conversations, until we were able to get on the phone and meet. And so he found ways during then to communicate with me, which, you know, was totally different on how he was probably communicating with other donors that he's worked with. And so I think really communication is, and having an understanding of who that donor is, what some of their needs are, and doing research on, you know, on the various communities and interests that they may be trying to impact that is not normal to, or not traditional to what you're typically used to. So I think that's where you'll start seeing more creativity when it comes to donation and philanthropy, once there's understanding on both sides.
And as a paid political announcement or a non-political announcement, Christian Mehta teaches our advanced fundraising course for all of you who are in or interested in the MPNL that gets at exactly some of those kinds of issues. Derek, do you have other questions? I want to make sure we run through those.
We do. We have, how does the landscape for leadership in the Canadian philanthropic sector need to change to address the diverse issues raised today? And are we moving forward?
I mean, I'm happy to take a stab at this, but I think that leadership in Canadian philanthropy needs to take a step back and listen. I think everyone needs to participate in active listening to actually understand what is happening, what the needs are. I think that's step number one. Are we getting there? I'm not sure, and maybe I'm an idealist, but the way I look at it is that I would love to see a future of philanthropy in Canada where philanthropy is not needed. It's not needed to fund basic human rights. It's not needed to fund housing. It's not, you know, suitable housing. It's not needed to fund access to wholesome food. It's not needed to have equitable healthcare access. You know, and so I'm not sure we're actually moving there yet. I think it depends on, you know, whether you're a realist or whether you're an optimist. I think that we have some severe setbacks that we need to push forward to. But the fact that we're having these conversations, we're having these discussions makes me very hopeful. And so I'm still keeping, you know, I think I'm still keeping strong on my vision of having a future of philanthropy in Canada where we don't need philanthropy for basic human rights.
Maybe another way to come at that question is in your own work, and Sharilyn, what you see from yours, what's been the greatest benefit, the greatest help to your work, and what have been the obstacles? In other words, what could we do differently in philanthropy that would have either not impeded you or have aided you in advancing your work? Is there anything that you would change about that context?
I think, so I'll step back a minute because I was thinking more about the last question in terms of charitable organizations, and because we're talking about next gen philanthropists, next gen givers, and the complexity of the issues that we're facing as a community and as a society. I think charities, they're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place in some way, in a very practical level, because you have next gen philanthropists who are engaging or are preparing to engage, but you still also have the very wealthy older donors. Who holds the wealth? Still, it's the older generations, right? And so for charities, as they try to figure out, their resource allocation in engaging donors, you have to make some choices, and I think it takes some very thoughtful leadership, fundraising leadership, organizational leadership, to make sure that a fundraising program, for example, has multiple points of access, that has some capacity to engage with donors at all levels and with a longer view. And I know from experience, having been a fundraiser and worked within the charitable sector, the pressures to get dollars in the door are very real, but it can't come at the expense of relationships. And so we need to be cultivating and stewarding both as we go. So within the charitable landscape, not to dismiss the next generation of donors, even though they may not have all the wealth yet, that they will as they grow, as they create more wealth, as they inherit more wealth. But I think it also goes to your question, Susan, about, are these young donors just giving the way they are because of their age? They're going to grow. Are they going to change? Well, as they grow, they very well might change and evolve. And what better way to do that growth than with charitable partners that really align with their values and how they can make change in the world.
Isaac or Sabina, do you want to add anything to that? Well, then
Sorry, to your question on obstacles or things that, I think for me, the one thing that I struggle with and I still struggle with, and so one of the things that I'm working on is how do we actually know who's out there doing great work? There's so many fantastic organizations. There's just no way for us to know, and so for me, it would be great to, again, and I think Sharilyn alluded to this, there's no portal, there's no hub for people to seek information from. And so, could there be an advisory group that actually helps guide people? This is what you're looking for in terms of trying to make impact and change. Here are some organizations, and I know we have, Good to Give Guide, for instance, by the Toronto Foundation that sort of tackles it, and a couple others, but it would be really nice to have a very nice dedicated hub for people to actually talk about some of this with their peers and see what everyone else is doing. There are times when I've come across organizations and I look at the work they're doing and I'm like, how have I not known you existed? And here, take all my money and do something amazing with it. So it's just, I think for me, I constantly struggle with that. So if there's a way that we can actually figure out a solution for that, it would be, I think, helpful for everyone.
We're almost out of time, and I said we have sort of 1 minute each for the punchline. What would you like to leave our participants with from this conversation? Isaac, what would be your key takeaway or your punchline?
I think the key takeaway is, philanthropy could have a ripple effect from an economic point of view. And so our form of philanthropy is how do we create more philanthropists? How do we create more donors? And the way we're doing that is by creating more economic sustainability within our community through home ownership, through creation of businesses and institutional relationships.
Sabina, your takeaway?
I would probably say, go slow if you're first starting out, but then don't go slow for too long. Once you have a really good idea of the landscape, go fast and furious. There's so much work that needs to be done. And of course, I cannot not make a plug for equity. Keep equity at the forefront of everything that you do.
Sharilyn?
I'll end by just saying how optimistic and inspired I am about the future of philanthropy. Not because we want to perpetuate. I take, Sabina, your point. We want to solve some of these big issues, but philanthropy does a lot of other things too, right? It connects us, educates us, makes things beautiful, creates opportunity, advances knowledge and research. And what I have observed and what I am learning about NextGen Philanthropy, it's not one thing. It's nuanced, it's diverse, it's interesting, it's exciting, and I think we're going to see a lot of traction on some of these big issues that we're trying to solve, and so I'm very excited about that.
Me too. I would conclude by saying that I'm optimistic because I see the students who come into our master's program who were there because they want to make change. They are interested in equity and justice in every sense. They bring a wide diversity and wealth of interests, of perspectives, and experience and background, and they are changing the world. So we need more of them. As we conclude, again, thank you to TD Bank, TD Group for your support, for believing in us. 10 years ago, when we started this program, we said it'll be a national program in a hybrid format that'll bring in both experienced and aspiring professionals. And there were many who said, you can't do it. But we did, and it's enormously successful. And TD was there from the very start, taking a risk on us, believing in it, and supporting better philanthropy. Una, any last word from you before we close?
I just wanted to say thank you so much for the opportunity. I think this is incredible dialogue. As somebody who's also started a family foundation, not wearing my TD hat, but with the Toronto Community Foundation for my daughter's legacy, I think the conversation that has been sparked today is going to carry forward and really help to make and address some of the complex social issues our communities are facing across the country. So thank you.
And to all who joined us, thank you. And I'm sure if you have particular questions, our panelists might be willing in an offline format to provide information on them. Thanks to all, and we hope to see you at our next event. Bye now.